The voice of fate is a cruel whisper in the night. In Ephesus, flames consumed the Temple of Artemis. One of the 7 wonders burned by a nobody named Herostratus seeking fame. It was July 21, 356. Legend says the goddess Artemis was absent from her sanctuary, occupied with a more important task, assisting a birth thousands of miles away in the cold Macedonian capital of Pella. As a masterpiece of humanity turned to ash, a child predestined to conquer the world and rebuild that very temple was born. His name was Alexander. To understand him, we must first see his homeland through Greek eyes. Macedonia was not Athens or Sparta. It was a wild, mountainous kingdom on Greece's northern periphery, a land of shepherds and unstable borders, constantly threatened by northern tribes like the Illyrians and Thracians. To sophisticated Athenians, it was semi-barbaric. Its geography, fertile plains like Pella's surrounded by vast highlands, forged a culture of warrior nobles living in a feudal relationship with their king. While Athens debated philosophy, Pella feasted, drank, and waged war. This is Alexander's first context, for his father, Philip II, took this rustic base and forged it into the ancient world's most efficient war machine. The true architect of empire was Philip, a diplomatic and military genius. He ascended the throne in 359, but at absolute crisis. His salvation lay not in defense, but in radical offense. Requiring a wholly new army, he made military service a state-funded, full-time career, ensuring iron discipline. His masterstroke was perfecting the Macedonian phalanx, equipping his infantry with the sarissa, a pike 5 to 6 meters long. A formation 16 ranks deep created a virtually impenetrable wall of iron points. But victory relied on the perfect integration of specialized units, lighter elite infantry, and crucially, the heavy cavalry of the companion nobility, whose sole purpose was the decisive charge. Philip used the phalanx to pin the enemy, while his cavalry, often led by himself or his son, shattered an exposed flank. With this unstoppable machine, Philip conquered southern Greece at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where young Alexander led the cavalry. After this victory, Philip united his rivals in the League of Corinth, naming himself hegemon, supreme leader of all Greece. His goal was no longer just Macedonia, but pan-Hellenic vengeance against the old enemy, the Persian Empire. Thus, Philip bequeathed to his son a loyal, battle-tested army and a universal cause. Amid this political and military storm, the figures who would create the God-man were shaped. His father was Philip, the pragmatist, the cold strategist. But his mother, Olympias of Epirus, was a telluric force of passion, mysticism, and terror. A princess from the tribal region of Epirus, she boasted descent from the epic hero Achilles. Her piety was esoteric, tied to mystic cults involving serpents. The relationship between Philip and Olympias was volcanic. Historians say Philip grew weary of her fiery rituals when Alexander was a child. In this atmosphere of tension, power, and myth, Alexander was born, accompanied by the prophecy of the temple's burning. To contemporaries, the birth of a conqueror, as a world wonder burned, was no coincidence. It was an unequivocal sign. The newborn would be a force of nature, a portent of destruction and refoundation. Alexander was built from the Wamba rough Macedonian prince by his father's inheritance, but imbued with the fire, passion, and sense of epic destiny by his indomitable mother. This child was the inevitable result of a king's ambition and a queen's prophecy that her son was destined to surpass Achilles. This fusion of modern military strategy and ancient mysticism explains why, at barely 20, Alexander dared to dream of controlling the world. His childhood was not a fairy tale, but the brutal preparation of a king for perpetual war. The most powerful formative influence was his mother, Olympias. Philip taught him the world of politics and the army, but Olympia transmitted a vision of his extraordinary destiny, a controlled megalomania, and a profound sense of superiority. She immersed him in the mystic, orgiastic cults of Epirus, reinforcing the idea he was touched by the divine, not a common man. The true turning point was the legend of Bucephalus. A merchant brought a magnificent jet-black horse to Pella, so wild and temperamental no one could tame it. As professional handlers failed, young Alexander, just 12 or 13, stepped forward. He observed the horse was spooked by its own shadow, moving in sunlight. With calm beyond his years, he turned the horse to face the sun, so it could not see its shadow, then soothed and mounted it, riding back triumphantly. This moment is a window into his military and psychological genius. The untamable horse symbolized the wild challenges fate would offer. In taming Bucephalus, Alexander demonstrated not just physical courage, but critical observation and lateral thinking. While others saw a problem of brute force, he saw a problem of psychology. Philip, overwhelmed with pride and premonition, exclaimed, "My son, seek out a kingdom equal to yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." This was the pragmatic father's prophetic validation of the greatness the mystical mother had already instilled. Philip gave Alexander the army, and Olympias gave him the ambition. But the future conqueror's mind was shaped by the most extraordinary tutor antiquity could offer, the philosopher Aristotle. From 343 to 340 BC, Philip hired the great thinker to educate his son and the elite young Macedonian nobles at the idyllic Temple of the Nymphs at Mysa. Aristotle imparted not just rhetoric, which would allow Alexander to inspire his troops with eloquent speeches, but also philosophy, ethics, politics, and science. This scientific education, botany, zoology, geography, medicine, became a tool of conquest. Medical knowledge let him care for his wounded when insufficiently. Geographical knowledge gave him advantage crossing rivers and deserts. The ability to classify and understand other cultures was vital for administering his vast empire. But one book defined Alexander above all. Aristotle gifted him an annotated copy, known as the Casket Edition, which Alexander would carry through all his campaigns, keeping it under his pillow next to his dagger. For Alexander, the Iliad was not literature. It was a manual for life and a mirror of destiny. The epic hero of the work, Achilles, became his model to follow. The young prince sought not only to emulate the courage of Achilles, but to confront his moral dilemma, the pursuit of immortal glory, even at the expense of a short, violent life. This obsession with the Homeric hero became the psychological engine driving Alexander to the ends of the earth, explaining his most audacious acts, like visiting Achilles' tomb at the start of his Persian campaign. His education under Aristotle provided an intellectual framework to justify his total ambition. Theory had to become practice. At 16, While his father Philip was campaigning, Alexander was named regent and sent to quell a Thracian revolt. He founded his first city, Alexandropolis, displaying precocious administrative talent. His true trial came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where the independence of the great Greek city-states ended. Philip placed his 18-year-old son in command of the crucial companion cavalry on the left wing. As Philip's right wing feigned a slow retreat, luring the Athenians and Thebans out of formation, Alexander led a devastating cavalry charge through the gap, annihilating the legendary Theban sacred battalion. The victory sealed Greece's fate and proved Alexander was more than a scholarly prince. He was a reality forged in blood and steel, yet his life balanced on a knife's edge between epic heroism and palace drama. Despite their shared glory, Alexander's relationship with Philip was one of deep rivalry and suspicion. The conflict reached its breaking point in 337 BC when Philip took a new wife, Cleopatra, niece of the powerful general Attalus. At the wedding feast, a drunken Attalus toasted the hope for a legitimate heir, a direct insult to Alexander, whose mother Olympias was from Epirus. Enraged, Alexander hurled his cup at Attalus. Philip, in a fury, drew his sword, but stumbled drunkenly. Alexander scornfully remarked on the man who planned to cross from Europe to Asia, yet fell between couches. The incident forced Alexander and Olympias into exile. A forced reconciliation followed, but the court was fractured. The family drama ended violently in the summer of 336 BC. During a grand celebration at Aige, Philip was assassinated by a young noble named Pausanias, who was immediately killed by guards, silencing him. Conspiracy theories swirled. Olympias, exiled and vengeful, had clear motive. Alexander, securing his throne, benefited directly. Persia's king Darius also gained precious time. Upon her return, Olympias allegedly honored the assassin and brutally executed Philip's new wife and infant son, eliminating any rival to Alexander's ascent. At 20, Alexander faced a realm in revolt, tribes to the north and Greek cities, emboldened by Philip's death, saw weakness. His response was swift and ruthless. He first purged the court of enemies, executing any implicated in the plot or with a claim to the throne. He then marched south with shocking speed, securing the allegiance of Thessaly and compelling the Corinthian League to confirm him as hegemon and leader of the war against Persia. The murder of his father was not an end, but the trigger that allowed Alexander to step from Philip's shadow and take possession of the war machine that would drive his destiny. The phalangists were ordered to open their ranks, letting the unmanned chariots pass, or to throw themselves flat beneath their shields. The vehicles crashed harmlessly into the camp. This small victory showcased Alexander's audacious improvisation. His relentless march pressed on toward the Triballi and the Danube frontier. There, in a display of sheer power, he crossed the vast river at night on makeshift rafts and inflated skins, attacking the Getae tribe at dawn. This surprise raid beyond the known frontier served a dual purpose: to secure peace through terror and to demonstrate to his own men that no geographical limit could contain their king's ambition. The most dangerous moment, however, came from the Illyrians. While Alexander was at the Danube, King Cleitus of the Illyrians and King Glaucias of the Taulanti united and besieged a crucial Macedonian outpost. Alexander marched to confront them, finding the Illyrians fortified on a dominant hilltop with an army too large for a frontal assault. He then turned to psychological warfare and martial display. He ordered his army to perform complex drills and precise maneuvers on the open field, a terrifying spectacle of discipline to the Illyrians, who were accustomed to guerrilla warfare. Witnessing the power of the phalanx, the Illyrians withdrew at nightfall without offering battle. Alexander, seizing the moment, crossed a turbulent river under cover of darkness and attacked their disordered camp, annihilating them completely. In mere months, Alexander had marched and fought from central Macedonia to the Danube and the Adriatic. His speed and decisiveness left his northern enemies not just defeated, but utterly terrified, sealing the peace in his rear with the blood of their leaders. But the greatest threat, the one that forced Alexander to show the most ruthless face of his power, came from the south, from the heart of Greece itself. While he was embroiled in the Illyrian mountains, rumors spread like wildfire. Alexander was dead. The Greeks of the south, spurred by hope and the anti-Macedonian rhetoric of the Athenian orator Demosthenes, rose in arms. Thebes was the first to revolt, expelling the Macedonian garrison and besieging the Cadmea Acropolis. Athens, though cautious, joined the rebellion. Alexander, of course, was not dead. Upon hearing the rumor, he knew the only way to disprove it was to appear in person with his army intact, moving with inconceivable speed. His force covered over 400 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, appearing before the walls of Thebes, before its inhabitants could believe the rumors of his death were false. Alexander offered Thebes a chance to surrender and rejoin the League of Corinth. The bands, with blind faith in their fortifications and the promise of imminent Athenian aid, refused, instead demanding the surrender of his generals Philotas and Antipater. This arrogance sealed their fate. Alexander ordered the siege. After days of skirmishing, the final assault began in chaos. A group of Macedonian troops penetrated a weakly defended gate, and the street battle that followed was a massacre. The Macedonians, furious at the betrayal, sacked the city without mercy. Thebes fell completely in 335 BC. The Macedonian revenge was brutal and methodical. The city was razed to its foundations, demolished completely, except for its temples. Crucially, the house of the poet Pindara, gesture of respect for the culture. Aristotle had taught him to value. 30,000 Theban citizens were sold into slavery. This act, costing thousands of lives, was not a fit of rage, but a cold, chilling political calculation. The destruction of Thebes served as the most brutal warning to the Greek world. Alexander's message was unequivocal. Macedonian hegemony was non-negotiable. Anyone who dared challenge his authority while he was occupied in Asia would face total punishment and historical annihilation. Athens, hearing of Thebes' fate, hastily sent an embassy, desperately begging for pardon and offering total submission. Greece, humiliated and pacified by fear, was now unified under the banner of Pan-Hellenic vengeance. The path to Persia was finally secure. With the ashes of Thebes still warm and the terror of the Greeks fresh in memory, Alexander took the final step to transform his position from Macedonian king to supreme leader of Hellas. The stage was set for the invasion that would change history. After his relentless demonstration of force at Thebes, Alexander did not need to beg for Greek obedience. He simply went before the assembly of the League of Corinth, the alliance created by his father, and assumed the leadership that was his due. Before the silent consternation of the Athenian and Spartan delegates, he was ratified as hegemon, supreme commander of all Greek forces. This title was far more than a political ornament, it was the tool that legitimized his ambition. Alexander presented himself not as a Macedonian conqueror, but as the leader of a pan-Hellenic crusade. His declared goal was not personal conquest, but vengeance for the Persian wars a century and a half before. The message was clear. The Persians, who had burned Athens and ravaged Greece, must pay. Thus the expedition was cloaked in an almost sacred morality, uniting Greeks and Macedonians under a common cause, though all knew the true motivation was the immense glory and incalculable wealth of the East. The League of Corinth, therefore, was not an alliance of equals, but the diplomatic tool that guaranteed that, while Alexander was away, Greece would remain quiet and provide the necessary contingent of light troops. It was the political pragmatism of Philip, applied with the audacity of Alexander. The success of the invasion depended entirely on the instrument Alexander had inherited and perfected, the Macedonian army, arguably the most lethal and versatile fighting force in the world at that time. It was a masterful combination of brute force, superior technology, and mobility, organized on three fundamental pillars. The heart of the army was the phalanx, composed of the pesheteroi, the foot companions. These were professional soldiers armed with the fearsome sarissa, a spear up to 6 meters long that, when lowered in formation, created an impenetrable barrier. Though slow, its mission was to be the anvil that fixed the enemy in the center of the battlefield. Behind and on the flanks of the phalanx moved the elite infantry, the Hydaspes lighter, faster troops, essential for protecting the phalanx's vulnerable flanks and for assaulting fortifications or rough terrain. The second pillar, and the true striking force of Alexander, was the heavy cavalry known as the heteroi, the companions on horseback. Formed from the Macedonian nobility, the heteroi cavalry was heavily armored, armed with lances, and tasked with being the hammer that delivered a devastating frontal charge once the phalanx had immobilized and disorganized the enemy lines. Alexander always led this cavalry at the spearhead, personally assuming the greatest risk. They were supplemented by the excellent Thessalian light cavalry and horse archers. Finally, there was the light infantry and the Greek allies. These peltasts, archers, and slingers were crucial for reconnaissance, skirmishes, and combat in mountainous terrain or during sieges. To command this machinery, Alexander relied on a handful of invaluable generals. The most experienced was Parmenion, a veteran strategist who had served his father and commanded the defensive left wing. His prudent judgment contrasted with Alexander's audacity. Beside him were figures like Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, in his absence, Clitus the Black, who would save Alexander's life at the Granicus, and tragically be killed by the king years later in a fit of rage, and of course, Hephaestion, his childhood friend, his confidant and second in command. This combination of experience, loyalty, and youth formed the backbone of the army, preparing to invade a vast empire whose forces outnumbered theirs, though not in discipline or tactics. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander's army, composed of some 35,000 men, 12,000 Macedonians, then the rest allies concentrated at the Hellespont, the strait separating Europe from Asia, today known as the Dardanelles. The invasion was no secret, but the crossing was a moment of immense significance. Alexander, however, avoided the land crossing already secured by a small contingent of his father's forces. He made the crossing in an epic manner. With a fleet of barely 100 triremes, the king crossed the strait to set foot on Asian soil near the coast of Troy. This was not merely a military movement, but an act of political and symbolic theater designed to cement the crusading mentality of his troops. As soon as he touched Asian soil, Alexander hurled a spear into the ground, claiming Asia as territory won by the spear. This gesture declared that his war was not one of defense but of legitimate aggression. But the most significant moment was his visit to Troy. Alexander went to the tomb of the hero of his childhood, Achilles, to whom he paid homage with offerings and rites. His friend Hephaestion, in turn, did the same at the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' companion. This act was laden with symbolism and legitimization. By honoring Achilles, Alexander presented himself as the direct heir to the Greek heroic tradition that had once defeated the Asians, the Trojans, who were historically associated with the great king of Persia. His troops were driven by a belief that invading Persia was a direct continuation of Homer's war, an epic destiny to lift them from history into legend. For Alexander, it was personal. His visit to Achilles' tomb sealed his commitment to Clio's eternal glory, compelling him to surpass his hero in fame and conquest. Crossing the Hellespont was not merely the start of a war. It was the curtain rising on the final act of a drama of ambition, politics, and Homeric scale. The League of Corinth provided the excuse, Philip's army the weapon, and Achilles' tomb the soul. Alexander was finally in Asia. His first move was a brutal confrontation with Persian satraps to secure Asia Minor's coast, neutralizing the Persian fleet and establishing a logistical base. With his rear secured, after the death of the formidable Memnon of Rhodes, Alexander turned south toward the Levant, aiming to dismantle the Phoenician heart of Persian naval power. This path led to the first great clash with the emperor himself. In the summer of 333 BC, near Issus, Darius III chose a narrow coastal plain flanked by mountains and sea, a fatal error that neutralized his vast numerical advantage. Learning the Persian army had circled behind him, Alexander turned his force of 40,000 to face them. While Parmenian's left wing held desperately against elite Persian cavalry by the sea, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a hammer blow against the Persian right along the mountain foothills. The charge collapsed the Persian line, driving toward Darius' royal chariot. Seeing Alexander approach, Darius fled. His flight triggered panic, turning the battle into a rout. The spoils were immense, but the true prize was the capture of Darius' family, his mother Sisygambis, wife Statira, and daughters. Alexander treated them with unprecedented clemency and respect, a powerful propaganda act that showcased his magnanimity and weakened Darius' standing. When Darius later offered an alliance and half his empire for peace, Alexander refused. He now declared himself Lord of Asia. To eliminate the Persian fleet, Alexander targeted the Phoenician coast. The island fortress of Tyre, deemed impregnable, refused him entry. In response, Alexander ordered the construction of a massive molea, 800-meter causeway of stone, and Timberto bridged the sea to the island. For 7 months, under constant attack from Tyrian ships and projectiles, the work continued. Only after assembling a fleet from surrendered Phoenician and Cypriot cities could he blockade Tyre's harbors and bring siege engines to its walls. The final assault was merciless. Thousands were massacred or enslaved. The city razed and repopulated with a Macedonian garrison, with Tyre and later Gaza fallen. Persian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean was broken. Egypt surrendered without a fight in 332 BC. Hailing Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule, Egyptian priests proclaimed him Pharaoh, son of the god Amun-Ra. He embraced Egyptian customs, founding Alexandria at the Nile Delta, a city destined to become a Hellenistic capital. His journey then turned inward, across the Libyan desert to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa. There he was hailed as the god's son, a divine affirmation that transformed him from a warrior king into a semi-divine figure, destined for global conquest. Emerging from Siwa, Alexander was no longer merely the hegemon of Greece, but a pharaoh, a son of Ammon, and the imminent lord of Asia. Only one obstacle remained: Darius III, waiting in the heart of Mesopotamia. The stubborn resistance to Alexander's destiny would not be tolerated. Tyre, which had defied hegemony for centuries, was dismantled by the sheer demolishing will of one man, and Darius' naval power evaporated. After Tyre's fall, only one major obstacle remained before the rich province of Egypt, the fortress city of Gaza. Perched on a 60-meter hill at the desert's edge, it controlled the vital trade route between the Levant and Egypt. It was defended by a eunuch satrap named Baptiste, who had sworn loyalty to Darius and refused utterly to surrender. Gaza's challenge was one of height. Idras's challenge was one of height. The hill was said to be impregnable, but to Alexander, it was merely an engineering problem. He ordered his troops to build a massive earthen ramp encircling the walls, a titanic effort to match the hill's summit. The siege lasted months and was extremely bloody. Finally, the walls gave way to his siege engines. The capture of Gaza ended in another act of barbarity. According to some sources, Alexander, wounded during the siege and furious at the resistance, tied Baptiste to a chariot and dragged him around the walls to his death, emulating his hero Achilles with Hector's body. This was an act of personal cruelty that contrasted with his usual clemency toward fallen kings, but it served its function. Egypt, terrified, lay open. The march into Egypt in 332 BC was radically different from the bloody conquest of the Levant. The land of the Nile awaited Alexander, not as an invader, but as a messenger of destiny. The Persian satrap, seeing the fate of Tyre and Gaza, made the pragmatic decision to surrender Egypt without a fight. For the Egyptians, Persian rule had been a period of oppression and disrespect for their ancient religious traditions. Thus, Alexander's reception in Memphis, the ancient capital, was triumphal. He was hailed as a liberator and immediately accepted by the powerful Egyptian priesthood. His coronation as pharaoh was a crucial moment. He presented himself before the Egyptian gods, offered sacrifices, and respected local rituals. Crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, Alexander did not just consolidate political control, he integrated himself into Egyptian myth. He was now the legitimate successor of the ancient pharaohs, the son of a divine lineage, protecting the cosmic order of Madarist. This political maneuver granted him total legitimacy, over the local population and neutralized any potential resistance. During his stay, Alexander demonstrated he was not only a military commander but a visionary urban planner. Instead of settling in the ancient capitals, he chose a spot on the Mediterranean coast, near the Nile's mouth, and founded a city destined to surpass all others, Alexandria. Its design is attributed to his architect, Dinocrates of Rhodes. Alexander's vision for Alexandria was pragmatic and futuristic. It would be the premier trading center between the Mediterranean and Inner Africa, and an impregnable naval base. The city plan was a perfect grid, with wide streets and a main axis parallel to the sea to ensure ventilation. The strategic location between the sea and Lake Mareotis granted it two natural harbors. Alexandria, with its future lighthouse, the Pharaoh of the Seven Wonders, and its immense library, would become the beacon of Hellenistic knowledge and culture for centuries. This city is proof that Alexander's legacy was not only destruction, but the creation of a new, interconnected world. The act that consolidated his new image as a being beyond the mortal was his journey to the Oracle of Amun at the oasis of Siwa in the heart of the Libyan desert. This trek across endless dunes, with a real risk of getting lost, was an almost mystical pilgrimage, seeking divine confirmation. The Oracle of Amun, the Egyptian god equivalent to Greek Zeus, was one of the most respected in the ancient world. Upon arriving at Siwa, tired and thirsty, Alexander was received with supreme honors. The temple priest, perhaps from a linguistic error in the greeting, or perhaps by Alexander's own instruction, addressed him not as the son of Philip, but as the son of Amun. The impact of this declaration was immense. The oracle not only ratified his legitimacy as pharaoh, but confirmed the story his mother, Olympias, had instilled in him since childhood, that he was the son of a god, not a mere mortal. The belief in his divine nature became permanently embedded in his psyche. For his pragmatic Macedonian troops, this fed the king's growing megalomania and cult of personality. For Alexander himself, it meant his ambition to conquer all of Asia was not merely a quest for power, but the fulfillment of a divine destiny. Leaving Siwa, he held the titles of King of Macedonia, Hegemon of Greece, Pharaoh of Egypt, and most importantly, believed himself and convinced others he was a demigod. He was ready for the final confrontation with Darius. After his transformation in Egypt, Alexander marched. He had exhausted the Persian coastal defenses and now moved toward the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, where Darius had regrouped for the definitive confrontation. The war transformed into an imperial hunt. Alexander left Egypt in 331 BC and led his army north, then east, seeking to cross the two great rivers of Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and the Tigris. Crossing the Euphrates was relatively straightforward, as the Macedonians found bridges built by the Persian army or facilitated by a surrendering local satrap. Darius still hoped to face Alexander farther east, so his attention was not fully on the river defenses. However, crossing the Tigris was a far greater challenge. The river was wide with a violent current, and there were no bridges. The Macedonians had to ford it or use improvised rafts. The army was in danger of being swept away, requiring the intervention of elite troops to secure the crossing. This dangerous passage was the last geographical obstacle before the immense plain of Assyria, the place Darius had chosen for the final duel. The news that Alexander had crossed both river giants with no significant opposition must have chilled Persian blood. The enemy was at the gates. Darius had learned a terrible lesson at Issus. This time, he would not allow a narrow battlefield to negate his advantage. He chose the vast plain of Gaugamela, near modern Mosul, in Iraq, a place his engineers had deliberately flattened and cleared to maximize the use of his main weapons, massive cavalry and scythed chariots. Darius had assembled the largest force ever seen by a Macedonian, up to 250,000 men, drawn from all satrapies of the vast empire, including exotic troops like Indian elephants, an element of psychological terror, and the feared scythed chariots. The Macedonian army, fatigued and outnumbered at roughly 47,000 men, took the field. Again, Parmenion advised a night attack to surprise the enemy, but Alexander, with his vision of war, rejected the idea, saying he would not steal a victory. He wanted a victory so clear, it left no doubt about his destiny. Alexander's formation was a stroke of tactical genius, designed to counter the numerical superiority. To avoid being flanked and surrounded by the immense Persian cavalry, the Macedonian army formed in a double oblique line, a hollow square or staggered echelon. The purpose of the second line was to pivot outward, to face any encirclement attempt, always keeping the phalanx protected. The battle began when the Persian cavalry, particularly the Scythians and Bactrians, attacked the Macedonian right flank, led by Alexander himself. It was a feint and diversion. Alexander allowed his cavalry to become partially enveloped in the fighting while moving progressively to the right, drawing his troops off Darius' cleared field and luring the best Persian cavalry toward the flanks. Darius then launched his feared scythed chariots to tear through the phalanx lines. These machines were fast but fragile. The Macedonian response was simple and brilliant. The light infantry opened ranks and let the chariots pass harmlessly through the center. Once the chariots crossed, they were annihilated by the reserve cavalry. While the Persian cavalry was drawn to the flanks and the Macedonian line stretched, a crucial moment emerged: a temporary gap in the Persian line between Darius' flank and his center. Darius had made a tactical error by continuing to move his cavalry toward the flank. Alexander, who had been waiting for this moment all morning, saw the fissure as a tunnel to victory. Leading the companion cavalry and part of the elite infantry, he launched a diagonal, implacable charge through the breach, straight toward the Persian center. Once again, the sight of Alexander and his cavalry charging directly at him was too much for Darius III. Before the Macedonian attack fully impacted his command center, Darius turned and fled in his chariot, escaping across the plain. His flight instantly demoralized the cavalry still fighting for him. Although Parmenion's left wing nearly collapsed under a Persian counteroffensive, Darius had already fled. Alexander had to abandon the personal pursuit and gallop to Parmenion's wing to save his general and seal the victory. The victory at Gaugamela was complete. The Persian army was annihilated or scattered. The empire was left leaderless, and the battle is remembered as Alexander's military masterpiece, a victory that demonstrated his tactical genius and terrifying appetite for risk. After the victory, Alexander did not delay in pursuing Darius, but instead marched to the richest and most symbolic city of the Near East, Babylon. His entry into the city was a triumph without battle. The local satrap surrendered and delivered the city and its immense treasures. For the Babylonians, Weary of the Persian yoke, Alexander was received as a liberator, fulfilling ancient prophecies. His acts in Babylon are key to understanding his new mindset. He showed deep cultural and political sensitivity, ordering the reconstruction of local temples, especially the great ziggurat of Marduk, which the Perses had neglected. He ensured administrative continuity, keeping the Persian satrap, who had surrendered in his post, alongside a Macedonian military governor. This was an intelligent policy that inaugurated Alexander's model to rule Asia through loyal Asians, maintaining the Persian administrative structure while controlling the finances and the army. In Babylon, Alexander was formally proclaimed king of Asia, solidifying his claim to the Achaemenid throne. He sat upon Darius' seat for the first time, adopting the symbols of an Eastern monarch. Babylon bestowed upon him immense wealth, the loyalty of an ancient culture, and confirmation of his status. Having defeated Darius' army and possessed his most prized capital, Alexander now prepared to take Persia's ceremonial and ancestral capitals, completing the empire's fall. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, the administrative capital. The city surrendered without resistance, offering itself as a gift. Its storerooms held treasures accumulated over centuries, an estimated 50,000 silver talents, a fortune that dwarfed any known in the Greek world. This immense wealth resolved Alexander's finances forever, flooding the Mediterranean with silver and initiating a new economic era. He could now demobilize his Thessalian cavalry with colossal payments, proving the war was for limitless riches as much as glory. Yet the true ceremonial prize was Persepolis, the ritual and sacred heart of the Achaemenid Empire. To reach it, Alexander faced the Persian gates, a mountain pass fiercely defended by the satrap Ariobarzanes. After a month-long stalemate, Alexander flanked the position via a secret path, securing one of his campaign's hardest-fought victories. It opened the Persian plain and the ceremonial capital. Entering Persepolis, Alexander found the greatest treasure of his expedition. Beyond the wealth, the city was a monument to Persian art and architecture, home to the great palaces of Xerxes and Darius. Here, in the ancestral heart of his enemies, he was finally crowned as the dynasty's successor. Yet, after sacking the treasury, a caravan of spoils requiring thousands of mules and camels, Alexander ordered the city's total destruction by fire. This was not mere destruction, but a symbolic act of unparalleled violence. The great palace of Xerxes was consumed by flames. The act served as propaganda and vengeance for the Greco-Persian Wars a century and a half prior. By burning Persia's ceremonial heart, Alexander fulfilled the Pan-Hellenic oath that justified his invasion, avenging Xerxes' burning of the Athenian Acropolis. He secured his legacy as Greece's avenger. Legend, recounted by Plutarch, attributes the act to the influence of the Athenian courtesan, Thais. During a drunken victory banquet, she suggested it would be a glorious finale for a woman to light the fire at Xerxes' palace. Alexander, his mind clouded by wine and rhetoric, allegedly joined her in lighting the first torch. The act remains a point of intense historical debate. If impulsive, it was a political error, alienating the Persian nobility he sought to rule. Others argue it was calculated, signaling the dynasty's end, and freeing Alexander from his debt to the Pan-Hellenic crusade. By paying his debt to Athens so brutally, he liberated himself to pursue deeper assimilation without answering to the League of Corinth. The burning of Persepolis was the conquest's turning point. It sealed the vengeance, marked the empire's end, and symbolized the moment Alexander began distancing himself from his Greek and Macedonian roots, fully embracing the mantle of the Eastern monarch. His next step was the personal pursuit of the fugitive King Darius. With the empire's financial and ceremonial heart in ruins, the war became a relentless chase through Persia's vast eastern satrapies. Alexander transformed the war's objective. It was no longer about conquest, but capturing the last Persian king to legitimize his own right to the throne of Asia. Darius had retreated to Media, hoping to raise a new army from the eastern satrapies, famed for their fierce cavalry. Alexander pursued with forced marches, covering astonishing distances, always at the head of his army. Driven by ambition and respect for his great rival, the chase intensified as Darius fled north through the mountainous regions of Parthia and Hyrcania. By the southern Caspian Sea, Darius was no longer a powerful king, but a fugitive. His fate in the hands of his own satraps. His final tragedy unfolded in the summer of 330 BC. With morale low and the pursuit intense, a group of his own nobles, led by the powerful satrap of Bactria, Darius' own cousin, conspired against him. Believing Darius too weak to lead, they took him prisoner, chaining him in a covered wagon to either hand him over to Alexander or proclaim themselves great king if they escaped. Learning of the betrayal, Alexander redoubled his efforts with a small, elite cavalry force, leaving his infantry behind for speed. In a final, epic gallop through the desert, he reached the Persian wagons too late. Bessus and his accomplices, knowing they would be caught, mortally wounded Darius and fled into the eastern satrapies. Alexander found Darius bleeding out, a spear still in his side, attended by a loyal soldier. The scene was one of profound sadness and symbolism. Darius died alone, not by his enemy's hand, but by the betrayal of his own. Alexander covered the great king's body with his own cloak. He had captured the empire, but his worthy rival had slipped away. Darius' death marked the end of the Achaemenid dynasty, which had ruled Asia for 220 years. For Alexander, it opened a new phase, a war of succession. He ensured Darius was buried with full royal honors in the necropolis of Persepolis beside his ancestors. This act was crucial, projecting the image that Alexander was not a mere invader, but the legitimate and honorable successor to Darius, the avenger of the murdered king. Bessus, meanwhile, fled to his satrapy of Bactria and proclaimed himself the new great king of Persia as Artaxerxes. This was a direct offense to Alexander's authority. Alexander spent the next 3 years pursuing Bessus through the vast mountainous east regions the Greeks considered the world's end. His goal was not merely to eliminate a rival, but to establish a precedent. Anyone who rebelled against the new order or betrayed a king would be punished with maximum severity. Bessus was finally captured in 329 BC, betrayed by his own allies. Alexander orchestrated his punishment as a spectacle of Persian imperial justice. Bessus was tortured, had his nose and ears cut off, and was publicly executed by the Persian method reserved for regicides and traitors, either impalement or dismemberment, by being torn apart between bent trees. By avenging Darius and punishing Bessus, Alexander sent an unambiguous message to the Persian elites. He was now the one true Shahanshah, King of Kings. This action was his first step toward deep assimilation of Persian culture adopting the ceremonial and symbols of the great king to consolidate his rule over the eastern territories. The young Macedonian had transitioned from a Greek avenger to an Asian emperor. With the pursuit of Darius concluded by Bessus' brutal execution, Alexander found himself deep in the most remote and wild satrapies of the old Persian Empire, Bactria and Sogdiana, regions corresponding to parts of modern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. What followed was not a war of great battles, but an exhausting, brutal struggle of counterinsurgency and guerrilla resistance. The peoples of Central Asia did not feel subjugated by Darius' fall. They were mountain dwellers and nomads, accustomed to independence and led by fierce tribal chiefs who refused to submit to a new Western invader. The inhabitants of Sogdiana and Bactria, hardened by climate and terrain, waged a constant guerrilla war. This phase of the campaign, from 330 to 327 BC, was for the Macedonians the most frustrating and costly. The most prominent leader of this resistance was Spidamene, a Persian noble who had participated in Darius' betrayal, but quickly rose as the true chieftain of the revolt. He employed hit-and-run tactics, attacking caravans, isolated fortifications, and ambushing small columns. This strategy tested Alexander's patience and stretched his supply lines to the limit. Alexander was forced to divide his army into small detachments to pursue the guerrillas, a tactic that went against his nature of frontal confrontation. The war became an endless series of skirmishes and brutal punishments against rebel villages. One example of the madness and genius of this mountain warfare was the siege of the Sogdian Rock. Many rebels, including the noble Achilles, had taken refuge in mountain fortress, essentially vertical, impregnable cliffs covered in snow and ice in winter. When Alexander besieged the Sogdian Rock, its defenders mocked him, suggesting they would only be taken if the Macedonians found men with wings. Alexander accepted the challenge. He offered great rewards to his 300 most expert climbers. Using stakes and ropes, these men scaled the most vertical and supposedly inaccessible face of the cliff under cover of night. At dawn, the Macedonians appeared above the defenders' heads. Terrified by what seemed a supernatural feat or divine intervention, the garrison surrendered immediately. The siege was not a military victory by force, but a triumph of psychological warfare and Alexander's extreme audacity. This feat, among others, finally broke the will of organized resistance. With the rock's fall, its defender, Oxyartes, submitted. It was then that Alexander met Oxyartes' daughter Roxana, said to be the most beautiful woman in Asia. Alexander, who had shown little interest in women, and was increasingly absorbed in his own myth, fell deeply in love. They married in an elaborate ceremony in 327 BC. This union was far more than a love match. It was a political turning point and an act of profound symbolism. By marrying a Bactrian noble's daughter, Alexander sealed peace with the Eastern aristocracy. Oxyartes and other local nobles became loyal allies, integrated into the new regime. The marriage signaled that the empire was no longer a foreign occupation, but a legitimate union between conqueror and local nobility, a blending and cultural assimilation. It was the first great act of Alexander's policy of fusion, an attempt to merge Macedonian and Persian cultures. He showed a willingness to honor and adopt Asian customs, to found a new race of leaders. This marriage, and the assimilation policy that followed, like adopting Persian dress, created the first major friction with his old Macedonian companions, who saw it as a betrayal of tradition and a dangerous orientalization of their king. By uniting with Roxana, Alexander declared his home was in Asia, and his destiny was to build an empire where Greek and Persian coexisted. Organized military resistance in the east had ended. Alexander was now ready to march toward the one place the man who believed himself a god's son had not yet trod: India. As Alexander moved deeper east, consolidating his rule through marriage and purging dissent, the cultural distance between him and his Macedonian generals became unsustainable. This phase was characterized not by battle against external enemies, but by internal conflict, purges, and the growing chasm between the god-king and his companions. Alexander, now formally Pharaoh and King of Kings in Asia, sought to adopt Persian imperial customs to legitimize his rule. One of the most sensitive was proskynesis, the act of prostrating oneself or kneeling to kiss the ground or the monarch's hand. For Persians, this was a social custom denoting respect for rank, but for Greeks and Macedonians, proskynesis was an act of divine worship reserved for gods alone. Alexander attempted to impose this custom at his court to treat his Macedonian and Persian subjects equally, demonstrating his status had transcended mere earthly royalty. The attempt provoked immediate and open resistance, led by Callisthenes, the official historian of the expedition, and significantly, Aristotle's nephew, Callisthenes, represented the Greek intellectual and democratic tradition. He argued publicly that accepting prostration would be humiliating and degrading for free Macedonian men. At a famous banquet, Callisthenes refused to kneel, and his argument was so convincing, Alexander was forced to temporarily withdraw the demand. This episode was the clearest sign of the growing tension between the two factions. The king embracing Oriental despotism and divination, and his veterans clinging to Macedonian warrior tradition and freedoms. For Alexander, the refusal was a direct challenge to his authority. For the Macedonians, proskynesis was the line separating a king from a tyrant. Alexander's frustration with resistance to his divinization and his growing adoption of Persian ceremony, like dress and a eunuch guard, made him more susceptible to paranoia and outbursts of rage, especially under wine's influence, a flaw his father Philip had known well. The conflict culminated one fateful night. During a banquet in Maracanda, Clitus the Black was one of Alexander's oldest and most loyal generals, the man who had saved his life at the Granicus. Amid drinking and flattery, conversation turned to a debate, comparing Alexander's achievements to those of his father Philip. Clitus, drunk and angered by the king's arrogance and the Persian adulation at court, dared to defend Philip's memory. He argued that Philip's old generals were the true architects of victory, and that Alexander was unworthy to scorn his father's glories. Clitus even raised his hand, showing the scar from the blow he had deflected from the king at the Granicus, and shouted, "It was this hand that saved you, Alexander." Alexander's wrath was instant and terrifying. Ignoring the pleas of friends, trying to remove Clitus from the hall, Alexander took a spear and mortally stabbed Clitus the Black. The remorse was equally extreme. After the act, Alexander fell into a deep depression, shutting himself in his tent for 3 days, weeping and lamenting the murder of his savior and friend. This episode was a point of no return. It showed the Macedonians, The king was willing to kill his closest friends, and that drink and megalomania were transforming him into an unpredictable despot. Soon after Cleitus' murder, Alexander moved to eliminate critical voices. His target was the aforementioned Callisthenes. Though not directly responsible for the next intrigue, his public opposition to Proskynesis had marked him as the intellectual leader of the resistance. The opportunity for his purge came with the so-called conspiracy of the pages. The pages were youths of the Macedonian nobility who served the king. One, Hermolius, was publicly whipped by Alexander for an error during a hunt. Humiliated, Hermolius and other pages conspired to assassinate the king in his sleep. The conspiracy was discovered. Under torture, the pages confessed their plans. Alexander saw the perfect chance to rid himself of Callisthenes. Though there was no direct evidence of his involvement, the pages accused him. Alexander, convinced Callisthenes was the intellectual instigator of Macedonian rebellion, had him arrested. Callisthenes was imprisoned, and according to some accounts, died of illness in prison, or was executed soon after. The purge of Callisthenes, the nephew of his old tutor, signified Alexander's final break with the ideals of Greek paideia that Aristotle had instilled in him. It demonstrated the king's paranoia was taking hold. The execution of the intellectual who defended Greek liberties in the name of absolute loyalty and divinity was a grim portent of the despotism to come, just before the army crossed into the Indian subcontinent. After 3 years securing Central Asia, marrying Roxana, and purging Macedonian descent, Alexander was ready to undertake the last and most fantastical stage of his journey, the conquest of India, the lands the Greeks considered the eastern limit of the known world. This campaign would test not only his military ability, but the loyalty and endurance of his men. The march toward the subcontinent was no secret. Alexander used the route through the Cyberpassus and ordered his general Hephaestion to prepare the crossing of the Indus River. The encounter with Hindu culture was immediate. Unlike Persia, India was not unified. It was ruled by numerous local kings and rajas, often in conflict with each other. Some, like Taxiles, ruler of Taxile, who feared his powerful neighbor, King Porus, submitted voluntarily, offering Alexander aid, supplies, and guides. Alexander entered India in 327 BC, and immediately adapted to local politics, using diplomacy and internal division to advance. The Macedonian army, though fatigued by 7 years of war, was equally fascinated and terrified by this new world, the tropical jungles, the exotic animals, and above all, the size and complexity of the Indian armies. The cultural shock was palpable, and Alexander's curiosity about Indian philosophy and customs, including the naked ascetics, the gymnosophists, added to his troops' unease, who viewed any further assimilation with suspicion. The true Indian test came on the banks of the Hydaspes River, the modern Jhelum, a tributary of the Indus. On the opposite side waited the most formidable of the Indian kings, Porus, a man of gigantic stature who ruled between the Hydaspes and the Chenab rivers. Porus' army was fearsome, not only for its cavalry and infantry, but for its most terrifying weapon, a line of nearly 200 war elephants. These animals, the ancient world's true tanks, could crush entire formations, and their mere presence terrified the Macedonian horses, which had never faced them in combat. The river posed the challenge. Porus positioned himself on the opposite bank of the Hydaspes. The river was in full flood. due to the monsoon rains. It was wide and swift. Porus controlled all crossing points. Alexander could not cross without suffering massive losses under projectiles and elephant attack. Alexander's strategic genius shone brightest at the Hydaspes. He repeatedly simulated crossings at various points for weeks, sounding horns and ostentatiously preparing rafts. Porus, weary and convinced the crossings were routine and false, stopped reacting. One night, under a storm, Alexander took the elite of his army, some 15,000 men, and marched stealthily 25 kilometers upstream to a blind spot where a wooded island camouflaged their passage. The crossing was successful. Porus, upon learning of it, sent a small cavalry contingent that was quickly annihilated. The Indian king was forced to deploy his remaining army. The battle that followed was unique. Alexander used his heavy cavalry to outflank Porus' cavalry, but the true challenge was the line of elephants. The Macedonian phalanx faced elephants for the first time. The Macedonians did not try to stop them. Instead, they attacked the drivers and the soldiers in the towers on the elephants' backs. The light infantry attacked the animals' legs, sowing chaos and pain. The wounded elephants went mad, crushing and trampling their own Indian troops. Porus fought with epic bravery, leading the charge personally from his own elephant. Even in defeat, his valor deeply impressed Alexander. When he was finally captured, battered and wounded, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, and Porus replied with dignity, "Treat me as a king." The answer struck Alexander. Far from humiliating him, Alexander restored his kingdom, made him an ally, and granted him additional territories. This admiration, like his respect for Darius' family, showed the Macedonian king honored valor in his opponents, cementing a crucial alliance for controlling India. To commemorate the Hydaspes victory and secure his presence, Alexander founded 2 new cities on opposite riverbanks. Bucephalus, named for his faithful horse, who died after the battle, stood as a monument to loyalty. Nicaea, the city of victory, became a symbol of conquest and a control center. These foundations were seeds of Hellenization in the East. With this epic victory, Alexander had surpassed his hero Achilles. He had conquered Asia's heart and looked east, ready to face limits that existed only in the Greek imagination. Yet the victory was costly. His army was physically and mentally exhausted. The king's dream of reaching the world's end was about to collide with a force more powerful than any army: the broken will of his own men. After Hydaspes, Alexander marched east into the Punjab, proclaiming his goal to reach the great Ganges River and the outer ocean. But the army had reached its limit. After 8 years in Asia, they had endured epic battles, deserts, mountains, and the unbearable Indian monsoons. Rumors spoke of vast plains and kingdoms with armies larger than Porus, with more elephants they did not wish. At the Hydaspes River, the army stopped. The men refused to cross. Alexander attempted to motivate them with a fiery speech, reminding them of past glories and the promise of immortality. The troops' silence was broken by General Chaeronea, who spoke for the entire army. He argued the men were exhausted, many wounded or dead, and yearned only to see their families again. He asked the king to end the war and return home. Furious and humiliated, Alexander retreated to his tent, expecting his stubbornness and their fear to break their will. For 3 days, There was only silence in the camp, a silence louder than any armed mutiny. The army did not revolt. They simply refused to move. This was the only time in his military career that Alexander's will broke before the resistance of his own men. He accepted the decision with pain. He ordered 12 enormous altars erected on the Hydaspes bank, monuments to his campaign. And the limits fate had denied him. The dream of the Ganges faded, and the Macedonian king was forced to turn back for the first time. The return to Babylon would not be a simple retreat. Seeking new routes and securing India's coast for future maritime expeditions, Alexander divided his force. He ordered Admiral Nerchurus to take the fleet built on the Hydaspes and sail along the southern coast, exploring the outer ocean to the Persian Gulf. Alexander himself chose to march with the main army through the most dangerous and unknown route, the southern coast of Persia, crossing the terrifying Gedrosian desert. The Gedrosian March was an epic cavalry and a disaster, an error in judgment that cost Alexander more men than any battle. The army entered a desert of shifting dunes under a suffocating heat with no known water sources. Local guides, out of fear or incompetence, got lost. Food ran scarce and discipline broke. Men died by the thousands from heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Soldiers, desperate, killed pack animals to drink their blood. It is estimated the army lost about 2/3 of its strength, not in battle, but in the desert, a devastating blow. Yet, in the chaos, the legend of Alexander arose once more. Stories tell how, upon receiving a helmet full of water, he poured it onto the sand to show his troops he would not drink while they suffered, inspiring them to press on. His constant presence at the forefront prevented the army's total disintegration. Emerging from the desert, Alexander punished the satraps of Gedrosia and Carmania, who had withheld or misappropriated supplies meant for his army. The force, though diminished and traumatized, had achieved the impossible, completing the journey to the known world's end and returning to Persia to secure the empire. The army's return to Persia marked the final phase of Alexander's reign, characterized not by new conquests, but by consolidation, forced cultural assimilation, and the attempt to give lasting political form to his vast empire. The operational center shifted to Babylon and Susa, the ancient hearts of Persia. Returning from India and the Gedrosian ordeal, Alexander found many of the satraps he had left in charge of the central provinces, both Macedonian and Persian, had become corrupt and insolent, acting as petty kings. The Macedonian king acted with ruthless brutality and efficiency to restore order. There was a true purge of dishonest officials accused of embezzlement, excess of power, and disloyalty. Disobedient satraps were summarily executed. This act of swift, unequivocal punishment re-established central control, demonstrating that distance had not diminished the king's power or vigilance. Alexander made it clear he would not tolerate corruption. In this period, Alexander solidified his vision of a Hellenistic Eastern Empire. His plan was a state where Greek culture fused with the Persian administrative structure. He maintained the satrapal system, but now balanced it. A Persian governor handled civil administration and justice, while a Macedonian or Greek military commander controlled the troops. This balance aimed to guarantee local efficiency and central loyalty. The most audacious and controversial attempt by Alexander to realize his vision of cultural fusion was the event known as the Susa weddings. Organized in the Persian capital of Susa, Alexander orchestrated a mass marriage uniting the Macedonian elite with the Persian nobility. Alexander himself led the way, marrying Statira, the eldest daughter of Darius III, formally consolidating his claim to the Achaemenid throne, in addition to his wife, Roxana. Hephaestion, his best friend and alter ego, married another daughter of Darius. Some 92 high Macedonian officers and 10,000 common soldiers also married Persian and Median women in an elaborate, costly Persian ceremony. The event was not a mass romance, but a political and military declaration. Alexander was not only legitimizing his lineage with Darius, but forcing the creation of a mixed elite to unify the empire. The goal was for future generations to identify not solely as Macedonian or Persian, but as part of the new Hellenistic Asiatic ruling class. The reception among the Macedonians was generally one of rejection and indignation. They saw these unions as a degradation of Macedonian racial and cultural purity, felt betrayed by the king, who demanded an assimilation they considered an Orientalization. The accumulated resentment over proskynesis, the murder of Clitus, the adoption of Persian dress, the purge of Macedonian satraps, and finally the Susa weddings, erupted in the Opis Mutiny near the Tigris. In 324 BC, Alexander had announced a plan to send home 10,000 Macedonian veterans no longer fit for service, promising them generous rewards. The veterans, feeling despised and replaced by new Persian units trained in the Macedonian style, the epigoni, or successors, interpreted this as an attempt to remove them from court and replace them with barbarians. The army mutinied en masse and refused to obey. The men sarcastically demanded the king send the entire army home, leaving him with his Persians, his pages, and his father, Ammon. Alexander's response was a masterstroke of political theater and emotional hardness. He mounted a platform and, pointing to the mutiny's ringleaders, condemned them to death immediately, restoring fear and discipline by force. Then he locked himself in his palace for 2 days, refusing to receive anyone. He summoned the Persian guard and distributed titles and command among Persian officers. On the 3rd day, he brought in the Persian leaders and welcomed them as his new hieteroi, the highest title of Macedonian nobility. This act broke Macedonian pride. The veterans, seeing the king preferred the Persians and their own presence was no longer necessary, were humiliated. The mutiny ended when the veterans, barefoot and supplicant, presented themselves before the palace. Alexander received them, forgave them, and sealed the reconciliation with a communal banquet. The incident demonstrated the king did not depend solely on his Macedonians and that his policy of integrating Persian units was irreversible. In the end, the veterans were sent home under Craterus' command, but the relationship between the king and his old comrades was never fully restored. Alexander had won the most important political battle of his life without shedding a drop of his own troops' blood. After the Opis Mutiny, Alexander seemed ready for grand plans: the conquest of Arabia, the circumnavigation of the African continent, and the expansion of his empire into the Mediterranean. At the apex of his power, destiny intervened to end his reign. While planning new campaigns from Ecbatana, Alexander was struck a devastating personal blow with the death of his closest friend Hephaestion in 324 BC. The sources suggest illness, perhaps typhoid fever. Alexander's grief was extravagant and unhinged. He ordered the execution of the attending physician, the destruction of the Temple of Asclepius, and an unprecedented funeral pyre in Babylon. He declared Hephaestion a divine hero. This loss shattered Alexander's precarious stability. Without his emotional anchor, the king grew more irascible, erratic, and superstitious. His mind darkened by obsession. After reaching Babylon in early 323 BC, Alexander's health deteriorated rapidly following a days-long feast. A high, persistent fever led to 11 days of agony, culminating in an inability to speak or move. He died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in June 323 BC at age 32. Theories of his death divide between natural causes, malaria, typhoid, and poisoning. Suspicion fell on his regent, Antipater, and his son Cassander, who may have used a slow poison. The rapid decline and the convenience for his rivals made the poisoning theory popular in antiquity. On his deathbed, conscious but mute, Alexander allowed his Macedonian phalanx to file past him one final time. When his generals asked to whom he left his empire, his alleged last words became the trigger for its dissolution. To the strongest. As he handed his royal seal ring to Perdiccas, he merely designated a temporary regent, not a clear successor. His challenge to his generals to fight for supremacy ended his era and began the 40-year wars of the Diadochi, the successors. The vast empire, built on his personal will alone, immediately crumbled. The principal generals who carved it up were Ptolemy, who seized Egypt, Seleucus, who took the eastern satrapies and Mesopotamia, Antigonus Monophaemus, who sought to restore the entire empire, Lysimachus, who established himself in Thrace, and Cassander, who took Macedonia and Greece. Their first victims were Alexander's family. His half-brother, Philip III Areta, or Chaeronea, was murdered. His wife Roxana and his posthumous son Alexander IV were held captive and later killed on Cassander's orders. His Persian wife, Statira, was murdered by Roxana. With the bloodline extinguished, the dream of Greco-Persian unity vanished. The wars, marked by betrayal and colossal battles, culminated in a final partition, giving rise to the new political order of the Hellenistic age. Three great dynastic kingdoms emerged: the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, stable and rich, with Alexandria as its intellectual capital, the vast but fragmented Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia and Greece. Though his political empire collapsed, Alexander's cultural legacy endured. The Greek language, urbanism, and culture became the dominant matrix from the Mediterranean to the Indus. These Hellenistic kingdoms became bridges between East and West, setting the stage for the later rise of Rome. Alexander's life was brief, but his impact was seismic. He secured his place not merely as a conqueror, but as a cultural transformer, his figure shaped by centuries of legend. The primary factor for his conquest of the Persian Empire in just 7 years was his unparalleled military genius. His tactics were an extension of his personality, rapid, bold, and relentless. He perfected his father Philip's hammer and anvil strategy, the Macedonian phalanx as the immovable anvil, and the companion cavalry, led by Alexander himself, as the mobile hammer. He would find a weak point in the enemy line and lead a devastating diagonal charge to break it, always aiming for the enemy's command. His personal leadership was paramount. He was never defeated, because he always led from the front, suffering grave wounds that galvanized his troops' morale. Soldiers followed him to the ends of the earth because he asked them to do what he did first. This blend of tactical genius and charismatic, risky leadership ensured his decisions were executed with ferocious unity. Furthermore, Alexander was a master not only of pitched battle, but of siege warfare and counterinsurgency. His ability to improvise, like the nighttime crossing of the Hydaspes or the construction of the mole at Tyre, showed a mind equally adept at grand strategy and military engineering. The most enduring consequence of Alexander's expedition was cultural. By bringing his army, merchants, and engineers across 3 continents, he forced a process of Hellenization. The foundation of over 70 cities, many named Alexandria, acted as the primary vehicle for this cultural diffusion. These cities became centers of trade, learning, and administration, where Greek architecture, legal systems, and the crucial Koine language were established as the lingua franca of the Eastern elite. Alexander fostered syncretism, the fusion of religious and philosophical ideas, by honoring local deities like Amun in Egypt or Marduk in Babylon. This allowed Eastern ideas to blend with Greek thought and vice versa. His expedition included scientists, botanists, and geographers who mapped and cataloged the world. India, for instance, influenced Greek art, creating a Greco-Buddhist school of sculpture that shows the endurance of this mixture. Centuries later, when the Romans arrived, much of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East still spoke Greek and practiced a fundamentally Hellenistic culture. Alexander transcended history to become a mythical figure, adapted and venerated by nearly every culture he touched or that succeeded him in the West. Later leaders like Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte studied, admired, and sought to emulate his ambition to conquer the known world. His lost tomb in Alexandria became a site of pilgrimage. The Persian view is dual. Initially the cursed destroyer of Persepolis, he was later transformed in legend into a wise and just king of Iran, the Skandar of epics, who quested for the fountain of life. In the Islamic world, he becomes Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a prophetic figure in the Quran who built a wall against Gog and Magog. In Judaism, the Talmud portrays him as a conqueror who respectfully bowed before the high priest in Jerusalem. This universality of his myth shows Alexander conquered not only lands, but embedded himself in humanity's collective imagination as the archetype of the bold conqueror and the traveler seeking the world's limits. In just 13 years of rule, Alexander the Great transformed the small kingdom of Macedonia into the largest empire the world had seen. He changed the world map, accelerated the course of history, and fused West and East irreversibly. His life demonstrated limitless ambition, which finally met the limits of human endurance, first his troops at the Hydaspes, then his own body in Babylon. His legacy is the Hellenistic Age, a period of intense cultural mixing that shaped the world Rome would inherit. The figure of Alexander, the military genius, the drunken tyrant, the cultural visionary, and the man who believed himself a god, remains the very definition of tragic greatness in universal history.